This is New Zealand, an island nation located deep in the southern Pacific Ocean, nearly 4,000 kilometers away from Australia. It is often ranked as the second most peaceful country in the world. For many people around the globe, including myself, New Zealand is commonly associated with cricket, thanks to legendary players like Brendan McCullum, Ross Taylor, and Daniel Vettori. That was my first connection to the country as well. But in reality, New Zealand is famous for far more than just cricket. It is globally celebrated for its vast mountain ranges, breathtaking lakes, and high-quality organic food. Many of you may already know that the iconic film series The Lord of the Rings was filmed right here, among New Zealand's stunning natural landscapes. New Zealand's climate is quite similar to that of the United Kingdom, with mild summers, long winters, and frequent rainfall. Yet despite these familiar conditions, New Zealand's population is not even 7% of the UK's. If you look at a map of the country, you'll notice something striking. Nearly 80% of New Zealand is virtually uninhabited. Around 70% of the population lives in the northern part of the country, and remarkably, almost half of that population is concentrated in just one city, Auckland. Despite its pleasant climate, breathtaking natural landscapes, low crime rates, and a high standard of living, why does nearly 80% of New Zealand remain uninhabited? To understand this, let's take a closer look at the reasons behind this remarkable reality. If we begin by looking at a world map, one thing becomes immediately clear: just how isolated New Zealand is from the rest of the world. Even today, a flight from the United States requires crossing vast stretches of the Pacific Ocean, often taking close to 16 to 20 hours to reach this distant island nation. This naturally raises an important question. How did humans first manage to reach a land so remote from the rest of the world? There are several perspectives on this. According to New Zealand's official records, the country signals that nearly 1,000 years ago, between roughly 1320 and 1350, the Maori were the first people to discover and settle New Zealand. The Maori were inhabitants of the Pacific Islands collectively known as Polynesia. Official sources state that around the 13th century, these seafaring people left their home islands and traveled in large ocean-going canoes, eventually reaching New Zealand. This period coincides with a dramatic chapter in global history, when the Mongols under Genghis Khan were expanding their dominance across much of Eurasia. But the real question is, why did the Maori leave their original islands and journey all the way to New Zealand in the first place? To understand this, researchers have turned to Maori oral histories, which tell a slightly different story. According to Maori tradition, New Zealand was not discovered in the 13th century, but nearly 500 years earlier, around 750 AD, by a Maori navigator named Kupe. Kupe was a fisherman who provided food for himself and his tribe, relying heavily on the ocean for survival. Over time, however, a problem began to emerge. Every time Kupe cast his fishing nets, octopus in the area would devour the catch, leaving nothing behind. Since fish was the tribe's primary source of food, this quickly turned into a serious crisis. The solution was a bold one. Kupe and a small group of companions would venture out into the open ocean in search of a new island, one where food was abundant and survival was possible. And so, with around 20 to 25 men, Kupe set out across the vast Pacific Ocean. After days of travel, they finally spotted an island marked by towering mountains rising from the horizon. This was New Zealand, an untouched land rich in seafood, livestock, and fruit, and at that time, completely uninhabited by humans. It was the perfect refuge for Kupe and his people. Kupe sent a few of his companions back to the Polynesian Islands to spread the word about this newly discovered land. And in this way, the Maori settlement of New Zealand began. By the 17th century, the Maori were living peacefully across New Zealand. Isolated from the rest of the world, they faced no major enemies and little external threat. But this calm would not last. This was the age when Western powers were expanding their influence across the globe. Explorers were dispatched to discover new islands, countries, and continents, territories that could be claimed to strengthen European dominance and extend imperial power. As part of this global push for expansion, a Dutch explorer named Abel Tasman set sail into the southern Pacific in search of a rumored continent. At the time, Europeans believed that a vast landmass must exist in this region, one that could unlock enormous strategic and economic opportunities for European powers. In 1642, Tasman became the first European to encounter New Zealand. However, when he attempted to land, he was met with fierce and bloody resistance from the Maori. Forced into a violent confrontation, Tasman had no choice but to retreat and abandon the landing. Then, in 1769, British naval officer James Cook arrived in New Zealand while exploring the same region of the Pacific. Once again, violent clashes broke out, this time between Cook's crew and the Maori people. The confrontations turned deadly, and several Maori chiefs were killed during these encounters, marking another bloody chapter in New Zealand's early contact with European explorers. James Cook was forced to return, but this time he left with something far more powerful: a detailed map of New Zealand and the entire journey. Using this map, European settlers began arriving on the islands in the 18th century. This time, they dealt with the Maori far more strategically. By offering trade and the promise of profit, the British gradually established naval ports, and within just 100 years, they had taken complete control of New Zealand. In 1840, a treaty was signed between the British and the Maori, known as the Treaty of Waitangi. After this agreement, New Zealand officially came under European influence and became part of the British Empire. At that time, the Maori population was around 200,000, but over the next 100 years, instead of growing, it declined dramatically to fewer than 40,000. There were two main reasons behind this devastating decline. When Europeans arrived, they didn't come alone. They also brought diseases that were common in Europe at the time. The problem was that the Maori had no immunity to these illnesses. As a result, after European immigration began, large numbers of indigenous Maori fell sick and died. The second reason was that by the 19th century, New Zealand had turned into an extremely violent place. Just 5 years after the Treaty of Waitangi was signed, a series of wars erupted between the British and the local Maori over land ownership. These conflicts continued for the next 40 years and resulted in the deaths of a large number of Maori. The violence finally came to an end in 1881, by which time most of the major Maori chiefs had been killed, and the Maori resistance movement had been brutally crushed. After this, the British also realized that progress was impossible without including the local population in the process of development. As a result, soon after the wars ended, the British government began involving Maori communities as key stakeholders in everything, from the electoral process to major development projects. It was at this point that New Zealand's real journey toward peace and progress truly began. But even today, as we saw at the beginning of this video, a large portion of New Zealand remains virtually uninhabited. So the question is, why is so much of the country still empty, and why does the majority of the population live almost entirely on the North Island? In reality, New Zealand's southern region remains largely uninhabited because living and building in this area is extremely difficult. The southern part of the country is dominated by massive mountain ranges, steep terrain, and highly uneven land, making even basic infrastructure, such as roads, nearly impossible to construct. On the eastern side of these mountains, The land is extremely dry and infertile, which makes irrigation and large-scale settlement impractical. This is precisely why the vast majority of New Zealand's population is concentrated on the North Island. To address this population shortage, the New Zealand government relaxed its immigration policies after World War II. Prior to the war, non-white immigration was heavily restricted, which kept the country's population largely stagnant until the 1950s. Once these restrictions were lifted, migrants from Asia, particularly from China, the Philippines, and India, began settling in New Zealand. This shift finally triggered the long-needed population boom that the country had been lacking for decades. Today, nearly 27% of New Zealand's total population consists of immigrants, or people who were born outside the country. A large share of these immigrants live in and around Auckland. This is one of the main reasons Auckland has become one of the least affordable cities in the world. Land supply is limited, while housing demand continues to rise. To address this issue, the New Zealand government is now offering grants of up to around $8,000 to encourage people to relocate to Waikato, roughly 100 kilometers away from Auckland. The goal is to ease pressure on Auckland's housing market and help bring property prices back toward more sustainable levels. Another fascinating fact about New Zealand is that its entire agricultural industry is largely built around the export of animal meat. Thanks to abundant rainfall, the North Island is covered in lush, fertile land, making it ideal for raising large numbers of sheep, goats, and cattle. While New Zealand's human population is around 5 million, estimates suggest that the country is home to nearly 30 million sheep and goats. That's exactly why New Zealand is one of the world's largest exporters of mutton and sheep wool. Nearly 95% of the country's meat production is exported overseas. In 2019 alone, New Zealand generated around $46 billion in revenue just from meat exports. Despite being only the world's 51st largest economy, the backbone of New Zealand's economic strength is agricultural exports. Earning $46 billion from meat exports alone is, quite simply, remarkable. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below.